You will see why. And we're being recorded. Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me, Lloyd. It's great to be here. So today I'm talking a little bit about how to manage creative teams, particularly even if you've zero creative experience. So let's do this. I wanted to give you a very brief history of my career. So for about 8 years, I was actually an offline marketer. That's where I kind of started out. Then in 2008, I moved into technical SEO, and I also did a little bit of paid search. Then in 2010, I moved into content, and that really became my specialization. Between 2010 and 2016, I was part of the creative team at an agency called Distilled, based in London. And then in 2016, I moved to an agency called Verve Search, where I was head of creative. So I kind of went from being part of the creative team to actually managing one. Most recently in 2019, I founded Wordorist.com. And through Wordorist, I offer creative consultancy, training, and one-on-one coaching. At this point, I feel like it's worth clarifying the creative space which I most frequently play in. All content should be goal-driven. What you create depends on what you want to achieve. I specialised in creating content designed to generate coverage and links on high-authority websites. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. This is called What Makes a Hollywood Hit, and it's something we created for a client called Party Casino. Here, we analysed 40 years of box office data to see which actors made the most profitable films. This piece got linked coverage from over 120 sites. This is a piece called 24 Hour London, created for a client called Lenstore. It's the world's first gigapixel time-lapse panorama of London's skyline. It generated link coverage from over 150 sites. Final piece I'm going to show you, is Demolishing Modernism. This was created for Go Compare. It's a tribute to the modernist buildings we've lost to the wrecking ball. And it generated coverage on 200 sites. Today, some people call this digital PR. It's been called lots of different things over the years. I really don't mind what you call it. This is what I do. So linked coverage, as I mentioned, was the core KPI for the vast majority of my work. Now, the KPIs for the content you create may well be different, and that's cool. I think the stuff I'm sharing today will be applicable regardless of the type of content you're creating. In today's session, I'll be sharing 3 lessons I've learned about managing creative teams. Whilst I did have several years creative experience prior to becoming a manager, I'm aware that many managers of creative teams don't. As such, the lessons I'm sharing today will hopefully also be applicable, regardless of whether or not you've previous experience of working within a creative team. But first, a little disclaimer. I made an awful lot of mistakes as a manager, and the lessons I'm sharing today are lessons that I really wish I'd learned sooner. As such, I'm very aware that what I'm really dispensing here is advice. And the trouble is, advice is a thorny topic. I've written a little about this on my own site. Got some freezing of slides, sorry. The advice I'm giving is autobiographical. It's rooted in my experience, not yours. What I'm really doing here is giving advice to pass me, or at least that's what I would be doing if only time travel were possible. As such, any and all advice I'll be dispensing today comes with the following warning: this advice may not be for you. I recommend you sit with this advice for a while, try and figure out whether or not it's applicable to your specific situation. My dad says it's a good idea to listen to advice, but it's not always a good idea to follow it, and he is a wise man. So, background stuff's done, disclaimer stuff is done, let's do this thing. So, lesson 1. It's useful to know where your judgment is good, and it's important to know where it's really not good. Towards the end of 2017, someone asked me, how good are you at predicting whether or not a campaign will be successful? And I realised that I didn't have a great answer. I thought I was good, but I figured I ought to find out how good or otherwise I really was at predicting this stuff. So, at the beginning of 2018, I resolved to make a prediction about how each campaign would perform ahead of launch. How did I do this? Well, this stuff isn't strictly binary, so I created a scale. So we've got scoring bands A through to E, Scoring band A is more than 100 pieces of linked coverage, all the way down to E, which is fewer than 10 pieces of linked coverage. Using this scale, I began to make predictions about all of our campaigns ahead of launch. How did I do? Honestly, really not great. I correctly predicted the outcome of just 47% of our campaigns, which means I am wrong more often than I am right. So I'm wrong a lot, but I wanted to know how wrong I was. So I did some extra analysis. So where I'm wrong by one scoring band, I'm calling this a bit wrong. Where I'm wrong by 2 or more scoring bands, I'm calling this very wrong. So this is how it actually breaks down across the 100 or so campaigns which I made predictions for and then later analysed. So across all campaigns, 47% of those campaigns, I correctly predicted the outcome. 33%, I was a bit wrong. 20%, 1 in 5, very wrong. Understandably, perhaps, I wanted to figure out where my judgment was most impaired. So I then started cutting the data in different ways to better understand where I was going wrong. So the first thing I looked at was, can I spot a winner? So here I cut the data to look only at those campaigns which achieved either band A, which is 100 or more pieces of linked coverage, or band B, which is 50 to 99 pieces of linked coverage. My predictions are far more accurate here. However, when I'm wrong, I am very wrong. So you'll see here, approximately 74, 75% of the time, I was able to correctly predict that a best performing campaign, a winning campaign. I was correctly predicting the level there. 25% of the time though, I was very, very wrong. So I'm only able to spot a winner 75% of the time. Ouch. The next thing I wanted to look at was, do I fall in love with my own ideas? So if the campaign is my idea, how accurate are my predictions? Actually, I was really surprised to discover that here I'm remarkably clear-headed. You can see here on this graph, we've got all campaigns at the top, best performing is the second bar, the third bar is my ideas. And you can see close to 80% of the time, I correctly predicted the outcome of my own campaigns, and where I was wrong, it was only a bit wrong. So only one scoring band out. I then wanted to look at if I love the idea. Does that impact my predictions? Now, I recognize this might be tricky to pass. I made prediction based on how well I thought each campaign would perform, but a high prediction from me doesn't necessarily mean I love the campaign, or I'm passionate about the campaign, or I'm excited about the campaign. I want to give you a quick example. This is one of my ideas, which eventually became a campaign. It's called Highways to Hell, and the piece revealed the most congested roads across the UK and Europe. I predicted that this campaign would be a band A campaign, more than 100 pieces of linked coverage. And in fact, the results supported that, 317 pieces of linked coverage. So why did I give it this score? Why did I predict that band for this campaign? Well, it's a resonant topic in that pretty much everyone gets annoyed about being stuck in traffic. It has reasonable breadth of appeal because we can take it to both UK nationals and regionals and some sites in Europe. And I felt pretty confident at the time because I'd seen other similar studies gain coverage in the past. Do I love this idea? Is this an idea I'm passionate about? Is this the sort of content that I have a burning desire to make? No, it's not. So high prediction doesn't mean love. Back to the point. If I love the idea, does it impact my predictions? Yes, it really, really does. The fourth bar, marked love, you can see it's the worst, the absolute worst in terms of accuracy. If I love an idea, I will only correctly predict the outcome 35% of the time. The remaining 65%, I am either a bit wrong or very wrong. So I don't fall in love with my own ideas, but I do fall in love with other people's. Just the final piece of the puzzle, as a sense check, really, I wanted to look at how accurate my predictions were if I don't love the idea. Again, this is the bottom bar, don't love. Again, you can see accuracy shoots way up again. I'm pretty much the same in terms of accuracy if it's my idea or if it's an idea I don't love. Doing pretty well there. So what did I learn from all this? It's nice for me to know that my predictions are pretty accurate for my own ideas and ideas I don't love. Excuse me. But it's really important for me to know that I am pretty terrible at making accurate predictions if I love the idea. So, knowing the circumstances where my judgment is likely to be impaired is really powerful. Now I know I need to actively seek out and listen to other people's views when I'm pitched an idea I love, because in these circumstances, their judgment may well be better than my own. Now, I really wish I'd done this exercise sooner, so it won't surprise you to hear that I strongly recommend that you do this exercise yourself. Regardless of whether you've 20 years or 20 minutes of creative experience, start making predictions about the results of your own work now. Create appropriate scoring bands using whatever the core KPI is for your content. So for me, it was linked coverage. For you, your KPI may well be different. Use whatever is most appropriate. My next little bit of advice is to actually record your predictions. When I came to run the numbers of my own predictions, I was shocked at some of the predictions I'd made. I remembered things differently. Your memory is really unreliable. Each time we remember something, we reconstruct the event and we suppress memories that are painful or damaging to our self-esteem. So actually write down your predictions. Otherwise, this whole exercise will be inaccurate. Give it a reasonable amount of time so you have a decently sized data set. As I mentioned before, I did this across about 100 campaigns. If you can do something similar, great. If you can't get to 100, don't worry, but just try and have a reasonably sized data set. Once you've got your data set, go back and do some analysis. You will likely find that your judgment is considerably worse than you thought, but that's okay. It's far better to know the circumstances where your judgment is impaired. If you know, you'll be able to do something about it and hopefully make better decisions. Once you've done the analysis, share the results with your team. This might feel a little bit scary. I was a little bit scared, I'm not going to lie, sharing the results with my team. But sharing them and talking to them about what you think you've learned is really, really powerful. As a bonus tip, get others on your team to do this too. This might be particularly helpful if you don't have tons of creative experience yourself. I suspect you'll all learn a lot and it will likely lead to a bunch of really great conversations. So that was lesson 1. Lesson 2, the solutions to all those thorny problems don't need to come from you. For an awfully long time, I thought that in order to be a good manager, I had to have all the answers, or more accurately, that it was my job to come up with workable solutions to problems. When I reflect on this now, I recognize how wrong-headed that notion was. I'm sure you've been in situations where the solutions handed down from management, even if they were well-intentioned, actually caused more problems than they solved. It's likely that you felt frustrated or even demotivated as a result because you felt perhaps that you could have come up with a better solution if only you'd been consulted. Now, the realization that I didn't have to have all the answers or solve all the problems was a huge relief. My job was no longer about having the answers, it was just to facilitate finding them. For clarity, I am in no way advocating for operating under this hellish mantra, which I still feel I hear too often. Don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. Encouraging employees to come up with solutions to problems is undoubtedly a good thing. The trouble is, sending out messages like this doesn't do that. When you send out a message like, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions, what you're really telling people is, of all the problems you can find, I only want to hear about the ones you can solve. Now, you definitely need to hear about the problems people have identified but can't solve. And I'm sure that you definitely, if you had said things in the past like, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions, that wasn't really what you meant to communicate. This is really, really important. So this is what I try to communicate to my team. Bring me problems regardless of whether or not you have a solution. Just one further side note, in many companies that I've worked within, I've observed a tendency to flip any conversations about problems into possible solutions way too quickly. In my experience, you'll often come up with better solutions if you take the time to properly explore and understand the problem first. Talking about problems shouldn't be viewed as whining or negative. It's necessary, I think, in order to find good solutions. So, running sessions with my teams that identify problems, talk about them, and come up with solutions together was infinitely better than trying to solve stuff on my own. Creative teams, in my experience, are fantastic problem solvers, and my team came up with far better solutions than I ever could have done. Plus, as an added bonus, when a team comes up with solutions, they're already bought into them, which removes that awful management job of trying to sell in a solution, which is like an excellent bonus, right? So, as a bonus tip, position any potential solution as an experiment. Um, I used to say to the team, we're just trying something new for a while. So we weren't positioning this as like the solution we were going to stick with forever, or even like a perfect solution. We're just trying something new for a while. Secure agreement within the team to try out that something new. Agree a time frame for the experiment, then review how it's gone, and if it works, great. If not, either iterate or try out something else. This makes everything less scary for people because you're not looking for a perfect solution or a permanent solution. You're just trying something new for a while. While we're here, I just want to speak specifically about a couple of core problems. I've seen them come up in pretty much every creative team I've worked either with or within. So there's get there faster and be more creative. And often the challenge is get there faster and be more creative at the same time. Now, doing both things at once is undoubtedly desirable, but actually they're in opposition to each other, I think. I'll talk a bit more about this later. Let's look at get there faster first. So there are a lot of misconceptions about creative work. Many people don't realize the amount of time required to come up with effective creative ideas or the production time required to make them a reality. Do you still want to go faster if it means we're creating campaigns that don't generate such good results? Well, no, no one wants that. So how do you get there faster? How do you produce things faster? Well, it typically used to take us around 8 weeks to produce a campaign. I recognize that sounds like a long time, but what if I told you that for 25% of that time, we weren't working on the campaign at all? 2 weeks of those 8 weeks were just spent waiting on client feedback. Now, one way to trim production time would be to have the client feedback faster, which is a really cute idea, but it's unlikely to happen. However, exposing the production process can help people better understand these timelines. Within production processes, there are often dependencies. So there are things which need to happen in a certain order. Some things can happen concurrently, but some things can't. So for example, attempting to develop a campaign before the design phase is completed and signed off might not be the smartest idea. Creating Gantt charts or similar can help illustrate these dependencies. Of course, there are other potential solutions too, right? We can reduce functionality, which will likely reduce dev time. Again, in my experience, that's not been a desirable solution. Another option might be to hire more experienced data analysts, designers, and developers, because maybe those people will be able to deliver faster. Again, in my experience, this isn't often the answer people are really looking for. As a side note, to be honest, I'm not 100% convinced it would actually work in any case. Probably won't surprise you to learn that one of the best solutions to this challenge came from a member of my team, not from me. One of my developers highlighted that many of our campaigns shared similar formats or elements, and he began creating templates to speed up the dev process. He recognized that new or more complex elements would still need to be created by more senior developers. However, the bulk of most campaigns could be created by junior members of the team. So these templates sped up the process in and of themselves. Plus, they allowed more than one developer to work on a campaign simultaneously. And it was that really that allowed us to begin turning around campaigns more quickly. What about this challenge though? Be more creative. Well, part of the problem with that challenge, I think, is that it's so poorly defined. What does be more creative actually mean? I feel that most of the time it means do something new or different to what you've done before. Now, the trouble is, of course, if you're doing something new, you're in uncharted territory. The likelihood of you encountering unforeseen problems is therefore increased. And actually, it's safe to assume production times will be slower as a result. And that's really why these two things are in opposition. Get there faster and be more creative are kind of working against each other. I'm unconvinced you can solve both of these things at once. The best I've been able to come up with really was a compromise. So we would do some new stuff, but acknowledge that it will be slower to produce, and also do some stuff where there are fewer unknowns, and therefore we can be more confident of the likely timelines. So some things we can turn around more quickly, some things which will necessarily be slower. If anyone has any better solutions to that problem though, I'd love to hear them. Hit me up. Okay, final lesson from me. Lesson 3, figure out the highest impact thing you could be doing, and as far as humanly possible, just do that thing. Well, this is of course much harder than it sounds. It's really difficult to figure out what the highest impact thing you could be doing is. Often people might not agree with the thing that you think will have the highest impact. And also, of course, the highest impact thing will likely change over time. I'm going to share a few examples of some of the challenges I've faced and missteps that I've made. So, first example, not everyone agreed with my high impact thing. When I joined Verve as head of creative, I was responsible for a team of around 12 people. But only about 2 of those people regularly contributed campaign ideas for clients. Others felt strongly that ideation, coming up with ideas for clients, was the highest impact thing I could be doing. I, on the other hand, felt that teaching others to ideate was the highest impact thing I could do. Me being good at ideation is undoubtedly somewhat valuable, but 12 people being good at ideation is infinitely more. So I was challenged on 2 fronts around this. Firstly, I think there's a really pernicious creative myth that, you can't teach creativity. And in reality, of course you can. Creativity is a skill, it is not a talent. You can definitely teach it. I believe that strongly. I was also heavily challenged in another direction though. We don't have time to do this. It'll be much faster if you come up with the creative ideas. Now, that one's harder to revoke, right? It is of course true. It's much faster to do something yourself than train someone else to do it. But training others is always higher impact, and it's much more rewarding. So I kind of pushed back every time I was pushed on this thing. And one of the happiest moments of mine at Verve was when I realized that I was no longer the most valuable player in terms of creative ideas. I was no longer the human who was contributing most of the ideas. That was a really, really proud moment. I recognize, of course, that if you don't have a creative background, training and development might not be something you can personally do in some contexts within a creative team. But I think you can still own the challenge by either encouraging internal people with these skills to develop others, or bringing in external people like me to help. So, example 2, when I failed to notice the thing that people cared about the most. When I arrived at Verve, a lot of work had already been done in terms of mapping out progression plans, so like paths to promotion. So you've got this role you're doing now, this is what the next roll up looks like, this is what the next roll up from that looks like, and so on and so forth. So a lot of that had already been mapped out. But these documents hadn't been reviewed in an awfully long time, and much of the documentation was out of date. Because stuff like this has never personally motivated or even interested me that much, I'm ashamed to say I just kind of ignored it, which was a huge mistake. I failed to pay attention to that stuff for far too long. Eventually, not quickly enough, but eventually I made sure that all the paths to promotion were clearly worded, delineated, and measurable. If you don't do this, obviously people will rightly question why they aren't being promoted and potentially become very demotivated as a result. Other things to check include objectives and KPIs are aligned with what you need to achieve as a business now. Also be aware if you're doing things like inadvertently setting people KPIs or objectives which aren't mentioned anywhere in promotion maps. I was for a while, which was again a huge mistake. The other thing to make sure of really is that there are at least 2 or 3 roles above where everyone on the team is currently at. The reason this is important is it's kind of obvious, right? If people can't see what progression might look for them at your company, they will seek opportunities for progression outside. You will lose good people. So if I could go back in time, I would have fixed that much, much sooner than I did. Again here though, remember these solutions don't necessarily need to come from you. You can work with members of your team to update documents like this, and also I'd encourage you to set dates to review these documents regularly. So review them like every 6 months to make sure that they're still up to date. Final example. When I failed to realize that I could make more of an impact if I got the hell out of people's way. As head of creative, I was ultimately responsible for the results of all of our creative campaigns. As such, I was heavily involved in every piece we created for a very long time. And early on, when the team had less developed creative skills, that was probably appropriate. But I think that I held on to creative direction for much longer than I should have done. Prior to putting this talk together, I emailed a bunch of people who I used to manage to ask them for their feedback. And one person sent me this. He said, "You often had your own creative vision for a campaign, which didn't always square with mine." Now that is very, very diplomatically worded. But when I read this, I felt straight away like, that sounds like I was getting in your way. I was just in your way. I think I remained too close to this stuff for far too long. On reflection, I feel like I should have switched my focus to elevating people and switch my focus away from things like creative direction and been far more firmly focused on developing and elevating people. I should have done it much sooner. Now, I feel like this is hard to do, actually, if you've a creative background. In some instances, not having a creative background might be an advantage as a manager. If you don't have a creative background, the thing you can most usefully do always is develop and elevate people, because things like creative direction aren't where your expertise lies. So I think this might actually be easier, if you don't have a creative background. So how do you figure out the highest impact thing you could be doing? Ask your team. Ask your team. Here are some questions that I used to ask my team at various points. I used to ask them things like, what should I be doing more of? What should I be doing less of? What things do I do that you think you should be doing? Where do you think I add the most value? Where am I getting in your way? Is there anything that really annoys or demotivates you? Also, is there anything I do that really annoys or demotivates you? What are your biggest blockers? What do you think is holding us back right now? Questions like that, really, really useful. Now, you'll still need to make the ultimate decision of what the highest impact thing is, but I always found feedback like this from the team really useful. So decide on the thing, communicate the thing, and do the thing. Remember though to review and iterate accordingly. If you don't, you might find the thing that you've been focused on is no longer the highest impact thing you could be doing. Okay, it's about time to wrap this thing up. I just want to do a very quick recap for you. So, lesson 1, it's useful to know where your judgment is good. It's important to know where it's really not. So make some predictions. Your memory's unreliable, so actually record them. Analyze the data, figure out where you're good and where you're really not good. Share the results with your team and act accordingly based on what you've learned. Our judgment is considerably worse than we think. This might sound like a potentially problematic flaw, but I suspect it only really becomes a problem when we fail to acknowledge that this is the case. Lesson 2, the solutions to all those thorny problems don't need to come from you. Explore the problem thoroughly with your team. Don't leap too quickly to potential solutions though. Agree to try something new. You're not seeking a perfect solution, you're just going to try out a new thing. Then review and iterate regularly. If it works, great. If it doesn't, try another new thing. It's fine. Finally, lesson 3, figure out the highest impact thing you could be doing, and as far as humanly possible, just do that thing. Get input from your team on this, You'll likely have a view, but the things you consider to be high impact might not be the things that they actually care about the most. So get input, decide on the thing, do the thing, review and iterate. Finally, I'd encourage you to remember that getting things right is far more important than being right. So give people the opportunity to try stuff out, even if you're not convinced that stuff will work. Firstly, I'd encourage you to do this because if things do go wrong, people will actually learn something. It's a learning opportunity. If you're not allowed to make any mistakes, you can't learn anything. But you should also do this because that thing you think you know probably isn't a thing at all. There were countless times members of my team tried things that I was certain would not work, but I let them try those things out anyway. And you know what? In many instances, I was wrong and they were right. My team taught me way more than I could ever have hoped to teach them. And I'm very grateful for them. Good luck out there. A massive thank you to the humans who helped me put this thing together. And this is me. If you've got thoughts, feelings, questions, please do ask me anything.
Thank you, Hannah. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the Q&A. I'll be watching it. I've got a couple of questions that we can start with, but we do have a few minutes here to be able to answer any additional questions. So the first one, you were talking about KPIs early on. Can you talk about perhaps different KPIs that are used in content marketing?
Sure, absolutely. So, for example, you might have been tasked with something like improving conversion rates. So perhaps like your KPI for a particular page, rather than being linked coverage, might in fact be like as I say, might actually be conversion rate. So people completing a goal. And so you might iterate a page a number of times, but actually conversions are your goal. Other times you might have been creating content that was designed to rank well in organic search, in which case things like search visibility, organic visits might be a better KPI and a better metric.
And another question is, you were discussing, you had, I believe you said it was 12 people on the team.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, you were discussing about ideation. How would you suggest really teaching people how to become better at that particular skill? Can you go into a little bit more detail? Is there any particular training that you
Sure.
would suggest for that?
So yeah, I think that it's really about, certainly the thing that was most powerful, I think, for me was sharing my own process with the team. So actually kind of showing them how I went about this stuff, not because I necessarily wanted them to do the same things as me, but because it gave them a good starting place. So when I talk about creative work, I often talk about it in 3 phases. So you have inspiration. So it's at this point that you're really you're gathering data, you're gathering interesting things which are related perhaps to the topic that you're trying to come up with an idea for. So you gather inspiration, and you really need that to bounce off to create ideas. If you don't do any kind of inspiration work, then what happens is you're confronted with a blank page and you're trying to come up with ideas from nothing, and that's not how creativity works. So first seek inspiration, then you've got generation. So armed with the things that inspire you, you generate some ideas, and then the final step is validation. And that's really where you're thinking about things like, how confident am I that this thing's going to work? What evidence do I have that kind of leads me to believe that this is likely to be successful? And I think that really helps the team initially. And then beyond that, obviously, what I was really encouraging them to do was then share their own creative processes. So share things that was working for them. And ultimately, whenever I kind of teach people about creativity, what I'm really encouraging them to do is, experiment, find out what works for them ultimately. So, but sharing someone else's, sharing my process with them I think was helpful because it gave them a good starting point. And most of the time, the challenge with coming up with creative ideas is like, where do you start? How on earth do you do it? What does that look like? So, yeah.
So here's a question on motivating team members. So how do you provide a clear roadmap to professional growth for senior team members when
Yeah.
there may not be 2 or 3 positions above them to share as a path for their growth?
Yeah, it's a very, very real challenge. I mean, I I think honestly, it's a rough answer, but it's a true one. You have to create those 2 or 3 positions. You have to imagine what they will look like, and imagine what that progression path would look like. Because if you don't, if there aren't 2 or 3 positions above them, and they can't actually, you can't actually create 2 or 3 positions above them, then those people will leave. Because they will still inevitably want to progress. And if the only route to progression is outside your company, that's where they'll go, outside your company. So yeah, so as rough and as mean as it sounds of me, um, you've got to figure out what those positions would look like, and what those roles might be.
And the last question that I have here for now, and we still have a couple of minutes if there are any other questions, but last one here is, are there any particular traits or skill sets that you look for when hiring people for your creative team?
Oh, that's a lovely question. Curiosity. That's really the thing that I am most interested in. I think that I'm always keen to hire a curious human. Most of the time when I was hiring people, they weren't. Most of the people who I hired didn't have previous creative experience, and whilst obviously like it might be desirable sometimes to hire somebody with a bunch of experience, most of the time what I was really looking for was the right kind of aptitude and attitude, and people who are curious, people who disappear down rabbit holes trying to find stuff out, who have their own pet projects that they're passionate about. Yeah, curiosity is the trait that I would always seek.
Perfect. So there are no other questions right now. So Hannah, if you've got anything to wrap up with, you can do that. Otherwise, we'll be ending your portion of
Yeah.
today's event.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks very much for having me. I recognize asking questions in a format like this is kind of scary and hard. I have just published my slides online. There'll be a link out to them shortly. On those slides, you will find my email address. So if you have a question that you want to email me, I'd be more than happy to answer it for you via email. And thanks so much for being here and listening. It's been great.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Hannah. So it's 8:41 my time out here in the West Coast of the United States. We'll be taking a very short break, about 3 minutes, and then we'll start with Kevin Indeg in precisely 8:45 a.m. Pacific time. So 3-minute break, and then we'll be on with Kevin. Thanks.